Hello, I'm Greg Livingston here with Dan Silber to talk about his game Interstellar Invaders. Dan, how are you doing?
I'm doing fabulous. How are you?
Doing well. Could you explain what Interstellar Invaders is for us?
Sure. It's kind of a mashup of the mechanics of Breakout or Brick Breaker, and then it sort of adds a few of the mechanics from Space Invaders, from Missile Command as well.
Okay, you have the cities you have to protect and there's the enemies you have to shoot down.
That's right.
Okay.
But it's probably most directly derivative from Brick Breaker.
Can you tell us a little about your favorite level in Interstellar Invaders?
Well, it's a little difficult for two reasons. One of them is that the levels are still being tightened up. Every time I go to a show, I'm finding there are still adjustments. I'm still finding, even on early levels, I remember just a couple shows ago, I reduced the amounts of enemies on the first level by half because I needed it. I realized that people had a better experience when it was shorter and faster. So I'm hesitant to comment too much on a specific level because they're still being adjusted. But I guess for me personally, the meat of the game is after the placed levels. The meat of the game is procedurally generated, where the levels and enemies are not placed by hand but placed algorithmically. And so those are the things that I like best because I still sometimes get surprised by the combination of game states or enemies or that sort of thing. So for me, that's kind of the most exciting part.
Yeah, I feel like procedural generation, when it first got big a couple of years ago, I thought, oh, this is a fad, it'll go away. But I've seen it applied in so many different contexts to so many different things. It seems like it's become a powerful tool in a designer's toolbox these days.
I think it can be. It's hard to control. It has its own mind. So if you're willing to let go of control, it's really awesome. If you're a designer or if you're in a situation where you need to control everything, it's got a lot of drawbacks. But I like it because it keeps me still engaged and excited about this game that I've been working on for a while.
Yeah, I guess that's important that
Hmm.
when you spend a lot of time on a project to still have that level of engagement and enjoyment.
Yeah, for sure.
So in Interstellar Invaders, players have more control than in your typical brick breaker because you can use the left mouse button and the right mouse button to skew or curve the ball towards a direction. How did you find the right amount of curve to add to the ball?
Well, the curve was actually originally there to resolve a programming bug. There were certain times where the ball would get trapped on an infinite loop, like either it would get trapped between two portals and just keep going through them for infinity, or there are game items that have a gravitational pull, and sometimes the ball would get sucked into orbit. So it was originally just to avoid programming. It was kind of a design solution, and then once it got added, I found that it really affected gameplay for the better. And it was whatever I put in originally. Like I didn't actually, whenever I tried to fine tune it, it actually ended up worse than when it started. So it was kind of a fluke.
So could you tell us about that? Like when you fine-tuned it, what did you do and what made it worse?
The way it works is that if you click the left mouse button, it'll make the ball rotate counterclockwise. And if you click the right button, it'll make the ball rotate clockwise. And I can't remember exactly how many degrees, but when I made it smaller, it didn't feel like you were influencing it enough. And when I made it bigger, it was just too chaotic. I also tried a situation where it actually moves left and right, but it didn't seem to be as satisfying as this curving, although I can't really articulate why, but the game feel just wasn't as good.
Yeah, I took that for granted when I played it, but it does you're actually changing the direction of the ball's velocity instead of just shifting it.
Right, right. Which is super intuitive if the ball happens to be going from the bottom of the screen towards the top. If it's going upwards, it's much less intuitive if it's going downwards, but it is very learnable. I find that it's now intuitive to me now that I've been playing it a gazillion hours.
With this extra degree of control, is it still important for players to aim the ball using the paddle? If they want the ball to go to the right edge of the screen, making sure the ball hits the right edge of the paddle?
I think so because for one, I think of the being able to curve the ball as more of an upper level skill. If people sort of learn that and mess with that on level 1 or 2, it kind of messes them up and they end up dying right away. So one of the things that I've really tried to do is to cater both to a new player, but also to continue having the ability to improve your skill even for upper level players.
So that experienced players still have new strategies to look into.
Right, right.
Okay. And I noticed the enemies move around, unlike the bricks in your typical brick breaker. And how did you find the right speed for enemies to move?
I I don't know that I have.
So that's something still in the tuning stages?
uh, it is. I mean, to be honest, I think a big part of that is cosmetic. It changes the flavor, but I guess it probably changes the gameplay too. But it's for that sort of thing, it's really trial and error on the hand based levels, and on the upper levels where it's procedurally generated, I kind of get what I get, and so far I've kind of liked the results.
Okay. Are you looking to create the challenge of hitting a moving target, or are you trying to lessen that aspect of the game?
I don't know if I'm trying to do anything. uh, yeah, it really is. There are certain aspects of it where I have an idea and I'm following through, but there are also certain aspects that it's really trial and error, and some things seem to work, and I don't know why, and other things seem to not work, and I still don't know why.
C'est la vie, I guess. And the paddle follows the player's mouse or the finger if you're playing on a tablet instantly, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's a one-to-one mapping every frame.
Okay. And that's like older paddle games like Breakout, where you would have a dial to turn and you could turn it real fast if you wanted it to go halfway across the screen, but it was still something precise, a lot like swiping a mouse or swiping your finger. On the other hand, in Breakout, you have a lot more commitment because you have to kill stuff with your ball. You only have that short window of time to interact with your ball, whereas in Interstellar Invaders, you can curve the ball if you don't aim it right, and enemies will fire shots at you so that you have a lot more chances to shoot back at them. And I was wondering, what's your approach to commitment in Interstellar Invaders?
There really isn't a whole lot of commitment. You really do have a lot of opportunities to correct your course if you make a mistake, both in terms of being able to curve the ball if it starts at a wonky angle. But one of the ways in which the design works is that as you mess up in the game, as you lose your cities, you have 3 cities at the bottom, and the level doesn't end until all 3 of the cities get destroyed by the enemies. And so there's kind of this leveraging thing that happens that even if you lose 2 of your cities and you're down to 1, it actually design wise becomes a little easier because now you only have to protect 1 city instead of 3. So it's actually a very low commitment game on the spectrum.
That's pretty interesting that you don't have a static set of lives, but instead your quote unquote lives occupy space. And so if you're an inexperienced player, you can hunker against a corner and protect, just one third of the bottom. But if you're a better player, you manage to save all three.
Definitely. There is kind of a penalty in that it takes long each time your ball goes through an empty or an already destroyed city, although there's no loss, there's a bit of loss of time because it takes a little bit, takes a few seconds to reset the city, which is weirdly undesirable once you get into it. Um, I find myself playing much more risky just to avoid that second and a half or 2 seconds of reset time.
So that the ball has to hit the bottom of the screen before it can come back up.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. And you can reflect enemy shots. Like there's some guys that'll spit fireballs at you, and you can reflect it back at them. Is there any difference between using those fireball things and using your own ball?
Yes, a couple differences, which are, I guess, subtle, but they do, again, change the flavor. When you reflect an enemy shot, it goes up directly straight up in a Y on the Y axis. There's no ricocheting at an angle or anything like that. So there's less chance of it going wildly or going off the screen. So it feels more like your projectile after you've hit it. The other thing is that the fireballs are very forgiving. Even if you just barely nip it a little bit, then you will knock it back. Whereas the ball, the main ball that you're hitting back and forth is a bit less forgiving, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And in the upper levels, they start raining down a lot of fire at once, so you can have these Han Solo feeling moments where you're like, "Oh my god, I just saved the cities from 100 different bullets all at once."
The game also has a ton of power-ups. I remember you showed me one stage when I was at Gamescape that felt like it must have had every power-up in the game. It was pretty zany what was going on. How do you have such a wide variety of power-ups while staying relevant to the core idea of Interstellar Invaders?
Oh, I know what level you mean. That's right now that's level 25. That's what I consider to be the sampler level. It's not all of the power-ups. It just there are a whole bunch of power-ups on screen and it randomizes which you get each time you play it. I might change that though. I might actually make sure that they get more of a tailored experience. But I don't know that it does keep the core or not. um, I think it's situations like that where it's really hard to tell. It's really iterating a lot in the randomized levels to see overall in a number of different sort of circumstances, is it going to feel good to have whatever it is, the ball split into two balls and have them both go at once or any of the others. And, sometimes it doesn't feel good. And that doesn't mean that it has to feel positive. Some of them I think of as state changes more than power ups that are actually kind of undesirable in most circumstances, but they can still feel good because it can be something that would be a negative, but instead of taking away your health, it does something bizarre to the screen and does something bizarre to the gameplay.
So instead of good, maybe you would say interesting?
Yeah, but again, I try things and sometimes they work, and I've definitely cut some things that haven't worked right. But don't ask me what because I can't remember off the top of my head. Um, but yeah, I've definitely had things that either didn't work right or maybe I couldn't implement them in a way that was satisfactory to me, and so it's better to cut it than have it half in there and half out.
Right. So it sounds like in Interstellar Invaders, by and large, you're able to trust your gut to make these design decisions.
False. False. I work in mostly a sea of self doubt. I actually trust much more taking it to shows and seeing how people interact with it more than I trust my own gut. I trust myself maybe for things that are deeper into the game because I can't really see any of the mechanics through a new player's eyes. And, it's cool when I go to a show and someone will be like, oh, wow, though, that's a portal. And to me, the level might seem like a really boring or bland level, but then I forget that there are certain mechanics that no one's seen before. So I trust my gut about the big things, but for the moment by moment playing, I really defer to watching people. And a couple of shows ago, I noticed people kept leaving at level 10, and I didn't really think much about it. No one complained, but I realized after watching it happen a half dozen times, I started watching more attentively. What happens in level 10? And it turns out there was this difficulty spike that I had no idea was there. I just was totally unattuned to it. But it's easy enough to fix when you know it exists, but it's very hard to see it from a set of fresh eyes.
So using shows like Gamescape, you're able to cull a lot of hard data that helps you examine and understand the player experience.
Yeah, it's huge. It's huge. Yeah.
Okay. Also, along that vein, when it comes to game design, what would you say is the most important? The game itself, the developer, or the player?
Most important in, can you elaborate a little bit on in sort of what respect you mean?
So, well, I guess personally, I approach that question in an academic sense, trying to understand what video games are, what would be the most important to think about. But then I realize you're a developer, so maybe this would be the most important to you when you're trying to decide how to build a level or how to build your game in some respect. So I don't know if you feel more at home as an academic or as a developer or as a player. I guess there's a lot of different senses in which we can think about games, and half the fun of this question is getting to see what kind of lens people apply to this question.
All right, fair enough. I would say this for me personally, I really feel like when I'm building something, there's a certain inertia that it has on its own. And if I try and force anything, whether it be some sort of player experience or whether it be some sort of emotion that I want to express, it always comes out falling short. And usually if I just start building, each project seems to have its own life, and it's up to me to sort of follow along and help magnify that. In this particular game, it started as literally just brick breaker with explosions. I was like, I'm going to make a brick breaker clone, and I'm going to make some really explosions, and it was funny. But then once there were explosions, I was like, well, if they're going to explode, I guess they should be enemies. And then once they were enemies, I was like, well, they should attack. And then once they were attacked, I was like, okay, well, what if it becomes a projectile? And once there are enemies attacking, then I want different sorts of enemies and different sorts of attacks. And before I knew it, I had scope creep up the wazoo, and um, yeah, but I never felt like, oh, I want to make this kind of game, or I want to make this game. It's been much more this process of almost like archaeology, like I'm unearthing, like, oh well, what happens when we scrape off this edge, and what's under here?
Huh. Okay. That's an interesting way to view game development.
I think it's partly because I don't really have any teammates. I'm just working alone. So, and as I mentioned before, I have a tremendous amount of, it can sometimes feel like an echo chamber of self-doubt. And so it's not like, there are times when I have visions, but it's really more just trying something and following it and letting it set the pace.
Right. And I'm sure getting to take it to shows, gives you the confidence to say, oh, this was right and this was wrong.
You would think.
Self-doubt is not a fun experience.
It soothes its own. It takes it down. It takes it down a little bit, and each show it gets a little bit better because I can iterate from the last show, and I have a little bit more information to work from. So it does get better. It does help.
That's good to hear. Is there anything else we should mention before we go? Is there any social media you would like to plug or any other games or anything?
Sure. Well, we're doing the shameless plug thing.
Yeah.
Um, so I am on Twitter, and it's at Weird Game Dev, and I'm a real person, and I like to interact with people, especially if they're friendly.
Nice. Well, thanks for joining me, Dan.
Hey, thank you so much for talking to me.